There are headlines galore, most of them having to do with Israel's war in Gaza. I am lucky to be joined by Haviv Rettig Gur, senior analyst for the Times of Israel. Good morning, Haviv.
Good morning. Good to be here.
It is great to have you back. I want to run down the headlines and let everyone know what we're going to do. We're going to run through the headlines, get your reactions to them, and then spend a lot of time on this extraordinary Wall Street Journal scoop this morning. Somebody, either American intelligence or Mossad, gave to the Wall Street Journal the long series of messages that Yahya Sinwar gave to his colleagues in other parts of the Middle East. And it's an extraordinary revelation that Haviv will not be surprised by, but I think most Americans will be. But first, the headlines. 50 rockets launched from Hezbollah at Israel this morning after the Israeli Air Force struck a target deep in Lebanon. No one injured yet. The United Nations Security Council passed a U.S.-backed ceasefire resolution. Tony Blinken says that Prime Minister Netanyahu has reaffirmed commitment to the Gaza ceasefire plan. And a Hamas spokesperson told Reuters they're ready to go with the Security Council resolution, which I do not believe. And the Knesset approved the revival of the ultra-Orthodox enlistment bill as Gallant, a Likud member and the defense minister, voted against it. The High Court in Israel has ordered the state to demonstrate the supply of food is sufficient, food to Gaza is sufficient. I really don't know where to begin, and I haven't even mentioned the extraordinary rescue or what appears to be the loss this morning of 4 IDF soldiers in Rafah. So let's call this your reaction to all that first, Haviv, and then we'll go to the Sinwar story. Did I overwhelm you?
I mean, as usual, it's all a big mess, right?
Yes.
Look, some of the important threads. The Sinwar story is fundamental. The tragedy is that anybody is surprised or it's new in any way. The simple story with Sinwar is that this is Hamas's fundamental strategy. For 17 years, Hamas has ruled Gaza. It built its first tunnel even before it took over Gaza, a year before. It took over Gaza in 2007. It carried out its first cross-border tunnel attack against Israel in 2006. And the purpose of those tunnels, the only purpose of those tunnels that are enormous, they're the single biggest things Palestinians ever built. The purpose of those tunnels is to force an enemy to cut through the civilian population to get to Hamas. Yahya Sinwar, and now we see it in his own emails, but everybody understood it who knows anything about war, has been sitting underneath his cities, frustrated that he doesn't have 10 times the civilian death toll that is actually being reported out of Gaza, because then he believes Israel would be forced to stop and Hamas would win. Ralph Nader is an interesting example of this. Ralph Nader has claimed multiple times on Twitter that the death toll in Gaza must be somewhere around 300,000 dead. Why? The UN can't find 300,000 dead. Gazans can't find 30,000 dead. So why is there 300,000 dead? Basically because there has to be. In other words, his argument is there can't be so much rubble without those numbers that he decided. So what he's reflecting is the actual problem that the Palestinian ideological movement has. Not civilians. Civilians are not dying at those rates, thank God. But the ideological movement has a problem that there isn't a much larger death toll. And that's something we know Sinwar has been doing. It's literally his only strategy. By the way, it's not unique to Hamas. It's a classic counterinsurgency strategy. When the National Liberation Front of Algeria kicked out the French after 8 years of horrific terrorism, one of the FLN's great advantages in that war was that the French army killed 500,000 civilians over those 8 years. And that's how you win if you're an insurgency. So, yes, he needs massive Palestinian death. That is his only strategy for survival. It is Hamas's only way to win.
I love that you cut through. You immediately segregated the story about the journal from all the other developments which are ongoing and which continue to rivet our attention. And I want to go back to the Wall Street Journal story. We might get back to the other stuff. Americans like to deal with things that look American. Politics, Gantz, Netanyahu, we're familiar with that. We don't know what to do with a madman like Sinwar. We have not dealt with anyone like this since World War II. And I kind of feel, and I'll start here before I read some excerpts from the Wall Street Journal story this morning, as Americans must have felt in 1939, when there's a war going on in Europe that we don't want any part of, but FDR knows we've got to get involved with, we're looking east at Japan and we're looking east at China right now. But you're in the fight for your life, and there are good days like Saturday and the horrific days like today with the four soldiers died. But I was not surprised by this story, Haviv, because I've talked to you and listened to you with Dan Sinwar enough over the past many months to understand this is their attempt to have Algeria 2.0. Were you surprised by anything in the Sinwar emails and messages?
No, I was surprised that it's news. Only that. I think there's
that's a fundamental thing, too, that we're surprised in America.
Yeah, there is a sort of baseline. It's what you were just hinting at. There's a baseline difficult. Americans genuinely struggle. Let me preface that by saying it's one of the most beautiful things about Americans. But they genuinely struggle to believe that there could be someone for whom the mass destruction and death of his own people is the strategy. And that's because, Sinwar has a vision, a deep and old and powerful and profound religious vision that sees in the Palestinian cause the beginning of a great restoration of all Islam from basically what he sees as 400 years of weakness and succumbing to outside empires. And so the Palestinian people are a worthy sacrifice in the cause of the great war to restore Islam, and through the restoration of Islamic power and prominence, the redemption ultimately of the world. And so Hamas emphatically, and it says so, and it has been saying it since the day they were born in 1987 as a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza, and as heirs of a religious Palestinian tradition, of one branch of Palestinian Islam, not all of it, but as heirs of that tradition, which is even older than that, which goes back to the 1930s and even 20s. They have been saying it and saying it and saying it. They constantly talk, Google this, folks. They constantly talk about the Palestinians as a nation of martyrs. That's not poetry. That is a strategy, and it is a vision of history, and they believe it. They are not idiots. They are not extremists. They are not all these words we use to avoid the actual story they believe in. If you don't understand that story, they will continue to surprise you. And if you do understand that story, everything they've done so far makes sense.
And the future of this conflict becomes clearer, and I hope for us as well as for Israelis. Here are a couple of opening paragraphs from the Wall Street Journal story this morning. Quote, "For months, Yahya Sinwar has resisted pressure to cut a ceasefire and hostages deal with Israel. Behind his decision, messages the Hamas military leader in Gaza has sent to mediators show, is a calculation that more fighting and more Palestinian civilian deaths work to his advantage." Quote, "We have the Israelis right where we want them," Sinwar said in a recent message to Hamas officials seeking to broker an agreement with Qatari and Egyptian officials. In dozens of messages reviewed by the Wall Street Journal that Sinwar has transmitted to ceasefire negotiators, Hamas compatriots outside Gaza, and others, he's shown a cold disregard for human life and made clear he believes Israel has more to lose from the war than Hamas. The messages were shared by multiple people with differing views of Sinwar. All right, first question, who do you think gave this to the Journal?
I mean, whoever's listening, tracking Sinwar's, movements, Sinwar's messages. So it could easily have been the Americans. It could easily have been the Israelis. I'll just say I disagree with one thing the Journal said there, which is that he doesn't have a disregard for human life. He thinks that human life is how you redeem the world. You sacrifice in order to do this great thing that he believes is his mission. He wants the death. This is, again, hard to imagine because that's just not American culture. It's not American religion. But when you step out into the bigger, broader world, you encounter in some places people who don't think that way. And by the way, if you listen on Gazan social media, you will find huge numbers of Gazans enraged and screaming and angry and bitter at exactly that aspect of Hamas. You are sacrificing us. They don't love Israel. They blame Israel. But Hamas drags us into this war knowing we will die in order that we die. And they say it openly and publicly. So it's not a casual disregard for human life. It's not like, you have a dictator who's Saddam who's willing for people to die. That's the purpose, is their death.
So here is maybe the key couplet of paragraphs, Haviv, in today's journal story. In one message to Hamas leaders in Doha, Sinwar cited civilian losses in national liberation conflicts in places such as Algeria, where hundreds of thousands of people died fighting for independence from France, saying these are necessary sacrifices. In an April 11th letter to Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh, after 3 of Haniya's adult sons were killed by an Israeli airstrike, Sinwar wrote that their death and those of other Palestinians would, quote, infuse life into the veins of this nation, prompting it to rise to its glory and honor, close quote. That's a sociopath, Haviv. Might be a very intelligent sociopath, but that's a sociopath. Do you agree or disagree with me?
The man sat in an Israeli prison not for killing Israelis and not for killing Jews, but for mass murdering Palestinians. He was Hamas's, the Palestinians called him the butcher of Khan Yunis for killing anyone Hamas suspected of being, and for killing brutally, of being collaborator with the Israelis. There was no court, there was no trial, there was no evidence. If anyone suspected, Sinwar was unleashed to kill him. If you go to television shows in America that try, just for the sheer thrill of it, to imagine a mass murdering psychopath, shows like The Godfather or Justified or all these shows that deal with organized crime, Sinwar is that in living flesh. And so I can't help but agree with you. He leaves a bloody trail behind him. I suspect, I don't know the exact numbers, but even after October 7, he has still killed more Palestinians than he has killed Israelis.
Haviv, I don't know how Israel countenances the release of any hardened killer from their prison in a hostage exchange. I know the value that Israeli law and teaching, Jewish teaching, puts on the release of hostages, but Sinwar should still be in an Israeli jail. I mean, doesn't this give everyone pause?
There's no short answer, unfortunately, to that. You're talking about the 2011 exchange of 1,027 prisoners for the Israeli soldier, the Corporal Gilad Shalit, in which Sinwar himself was released from an Israeli prison, along with quite a few of Hamas's current leadership. And the simple answer is, the criticism is not just valid, that what you're saying, that we pay too high a price for hostages, and then we've even incentivized the taking of hostages by being willing to pay that higher price. That criticism is central to the Israeli public debate today. So you're touching something that's absolutely the right question. I'll just say that if you go into our history, you find it. In other words, the reason we will do anything for our people anywhere on earth, the reason we will carry out in 1976 the Entebbe operation, sending entire companies of commandos and infantry off to Uganda to rescue our people, the reason we will cross the earth and do whatever it takes is because we are, in our own story of ourselves, the last refuge, right? Palestinians constantly want to talk about the Nakba, the terrible experience of dispossession and displacement in the 1948 war. And the Nakba is something we have to talk about. It's their experience.
Right. The Nakba, and how Sinwar's release relates to that. It's almost the mythic legend that drives any society. We have our 1776. The Brits have their King Arthur, but the Palestinians have the Nakba. It's kind of a reverse mythology, Haviv.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll cut to the chase. I gave some of the background before, but people can get it on the podcast. But just to cut to the chase, Palestinians want to talk about 1948 and their displacement and that experience of trauma. And I think it's important. Their story matters to the future, not just of their people, but of my children. And so I do want to have that conversation. But here's the thing. The death toll of the Nakba in its totality is somewhere between 8,000 and 13,000. 13,000 is the number Palestinians use. Most historians, Western historians, talk about something closer to 8,000. it's a tragedy, but it's in the 1940s. It's like it's surrounded by these horrific tragedies on scales that are 3 orders of magnitude larger, not to mention what had just happened to the Jews. But what are if you want to get through the social history of the Nakba, right? What did the Jews know in 1948? Right? When 1948 comes around and May 1948 Israel declares independence, there are still 250,000 Jews in Europe in DP camps on German soil, on the soil of their murderers, who nobody on earth will take in, who countries take every single DP of 750,000 DPs, give them citizenship, find them jobs, and nobody will take the last 250,000 Jews, not even America, which had taken in most Jews who fled Europe over the course of the previous 60 years. And so the DP camps empty out into Israel. Really, they empty out. They begin to seriously empty out in significant numbers when Israel is founded. Now, here's the thing. They're a quarter of the IDF in 1948. The DPs, the Jews who know that there's nowhere else left to them. The survivors of Auschwitz who 3 years after what the Allies called liberation are still in German soil, often behind barbed wire in places like Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen and Dachau. And so, why do we, the original question you asked before I went off into a history lesson with apologies was, why do we Israelis pay unbelievable prices for our hostages and thus incentivize the taking of more hostages? And we're having that conversation and we're lowering those prices and we understand that that was a terrible mistake. But it comes from one of the most beautiful things in us. Ever since 48, ever since really the beginning of Zionism, what we are is the Jews who will go to the ends of the earth to bring them in. The first 130,000 DPs who land on Israel's shores and join the IDF and go into that war, the one thing they know is that they have no other place on earth. And so if you get into a larger social history of 48, you discover that there's this Jewish experience that creates almost an ethos, an identity. What I am as an Israeli is the guy who will go anywhere. In the 1980s, Ethiopian Jews are walking across the Sudanese desert, fleeing a terrible crisis in Ethiopia, getting attacked and murdered and kidnapped and sometimes taken into slavery in the deserts of Sudan. And there are Mossad operatives and an entire unit on operation going into that Sudanese desert to pull them out. And so what we are as a people is that rescue operation writ large. So that's why we pay that price, and that's why Hamas takes those hostages, and that's why this war doesn't end until they're back.
This war doesn't end until they're back. I don't think this war ends until Hamas is defeated in total. And people say that's not possible. I disagree with that. The Nazis were defeated in total. There are remnants of crazy right-wing nuts in Germany still, but Japan's imperial ethos was dismantled in 1945. But it really does require more than UN resolutions and Tony Blinken stopping by every 2 weeks. Is that iron entered into the soul of Israel, but it's not being communicated, or are they still hopeful about mowing the grass sort of working?
The only way to answer that question is to go into politics. But I think that there's no way to avoid it. I'm not going to tell you what I think. I'm going to tell you what the polls tell us Israelis think. There's a deep criticism among Israelis right now of the Biden administration, of President Biden, and the beginning of a suspicion that the Americans don't want these wars to end. The Americans would prefer a painful status quo for us that looks from afar like stability, to the costs and the destabilization of the kind of war that might end the pain for us. So we have, for example, right now in the north, this constant barrage. A quarter or a third of the homes of the town of Metula on the northern border are destroyed, and we can't actually get to that fight.
We began to touch on politics there, and I was reminded of what America thought, again, 39 till December 41. America wanted no part of this, and they wanted nothing to do. They wanted Japan to go away. They wanted everyone to go away after World War I. We are in the same position now, and the Wall Street Journal today tells us we can't stay there. So, Haviv, here is the next 3 paragraphs in the Journal story. Even without a lasting truth, Sinwar believes Netanyahu has few options other than occupying Gaza and getting bogged down fighting a Hamas-led insurgency for months or years. It is an outcome that Sinwar foreshadowed 6 years ago when he first became leader in the Gaza Strip. Hamas might lose a war with Israel, but it would cause Israel to occupy more than 2 million Palestinians. Quote, this is a quote from Sinwar again. If you're joining us late, there's an amazing story in the Wall Street Journal. They have a trove of Sinwar messages since 10/7. For Netanyahu, a victory would be even worse than a defeat, Sinwar told an Italian journalist writing in 2018 in Israeli Daily. And I really can't believe that. And I also can't believe that he believes that Israel can't win. But do you think he really believes that the insurgency cannot ever be defeated?
Yeah, he believes it. I mean, that's the tradition of Algeria, and that's the tradition of many other counterinsurgencies or insurgencies on which generations of the Arab world grew up. I mean, the Algeria story, it became the foundation in many ways of the Palestinian ethos ever since the 1960s. The FLN kicks out the French in 62, and the Palestinian factions get together in a room and found the PLO in 64, I think just 18 months later. And they talk in that room about the Algerian example. And Sinwar references the Algerian example. So I think he does think it. And he thinks that to make any kind of peace with Israel, reconciliation with Israel, any kind of two-state solution is a disastrous religious setback and religious loss, and therefore it's absolutely unacceptable. But if you force the Israelis to swallow Palestine whole, Palestine will destroy Israel from within. One of the reasons he believes this, by the way, is that a lot of Israelis say it, and a lot of liberal Americans say it. And so he thinks he's pursuing a very, very clever strategy. It's a strategy that I think for various, hard and serious and demonstrable reasons is going to catastrophically fail the Palestinians, just as it's failed them ever since the 1960s. But he does genuinely believe it. And it's not a stupid idea. He thinks he has historical examples that he's going by and that are going to see him through it.
Haviv, we're going to go back on the air in just a minute, but we're going to turn to politics then on the air, because I need to know if Netanyahu and Israeli politics are girded up for this, or if they're not. I mean, there's now a question in my mind with Gantz leaving the war cabinet, whether or not the essential unity that is required of a government at war exists in Israel. We got about 2 minutes till we go back on the air. You want to begin to give that answer, and I'll reset it when we go back on the air?
Most Israelis think we're going to lose this thing because they distrust the Netanyahu government. Every poll says that, right-wing pollsters, left-wing pollsters. There's a catastrophic morale collapse over the last 3 months, and it's about Netanyahu treating the war as politics. My own father is a writer, a thinker, a rabbi, a PhD, has come around to the idea that was once a radical, horrific idea, that Netanyahu is prolonging the war to prolong his politics, and therefore leaving people in dungeons, and therefore letting soldiers die. We froze the war for 3 months in Gaza because of American pressure. What does that mean? American pressure ultimately is the responsibility of the Israeli government caving to American pressure. And so, yes, I think that is where most Israelis are now, and it's an absolute tragedy.
Can Netanyahu's view, if in fact the Israeli public believes he is acting politically, there's a feedback loop that long practiced politicians must have, and I believe the prime minister does. I've only talked to him once at length when his memoir came out, and he's very sensitive to political factors. If this opinion of him has hardened, does he not have to break that ice by doing something dramatic and not only rescue missions that are successful and extraordinary, as Saturday's was, but also maybe going for broke in the north and going for broke in Gaza?
I don't know that he can control, the pace of events, the pace of the news cycle in terms of, for example, rescue missions. But I can tell you that if you want to take a signal for how he is managing the war, then there is what we talked about in the podcast segment, which I can try and repeat, but maybe add to a little bit. Most Israelis in most polls say that Netanyahu is politicking his way through the war. That is a catastrophic thing for most Israelis to be saying, because what it means is that, for example, there was a period where the Israeli army basically didn't move for 3 months, and there was a lot of talk about how that's American pressure. Well, American pressure is all well and good, but you need someone to be pressured. In other words, it's an Israeli government caving to that American pressure. And that delay left hostages in their dungeons, and that delay left soldiers to have these operations and potentially be dying because we couldn't cut off the Hamas, for example, weapons supply through the tunnels to Egypt by going into Rafah because the Israeli army had stopped for artificial reasons. There's a lot of criticism of the Biden administration. It had told us things that are just patently ridiculous, that it would be impossible to move the civilians out of Rafah. It would take 4 months. We did it in about 10 days, that the whole Rafah operation would be a cataclysm, but it wasn't. It was actually one of the least deadly battles of the Gaza war for Palestinian civilians. And so there is this Israeli army that has proven incredibly competent, terribly suffering Israeli hostages, and an Israeli government that seems to be always at every turn taking the path of least resistance. When there's resistance from the far-right factions and they say, you have to push through, then Netanyahu pushes through. And when Biden comes and pressures him and says, stop, then he stops. He always does what he thinks is his own political survival. Now, in peacetime, with a good economy, fine. You're only thinking about yourself. You're only thinking about your politics. Most American administrations are essentially campaigns continuing through their policies. I'm okay with that. I'm a political analyst. I know what politicians are like. In a war, we need decisions. And a man who can't make decisions shouldn't be running a country at war. And so there is, in the Israeli polling, we're talking about deep, deep into the Likud base, tremendous anger and frustration at Netanyahu. It's important to understand what this means. When Israelis say Netanyahu is politicking his way through the war, they are saying that for his political survival, he is willing to leave to 120 Israelis sitting in dungeons in Gaza. It is a
for the
horrific
first time yesterday.
Very, very
I had an American Jew, Bethany Mandel, who's a very, very conservative, often on this program, commentator, remarked to me that she thought Netanyahu was failing. This is increasingly sound. Again, I always use historical analogies. They're imperfect, but Algeria works, and I'm going to use this one. If Netanyahu isn't Churchill, then he's Chamberlain. And if Nasrallah, who, for the benefit of the audience, runs Hezbollah to the extent that Khamenei in Iran doesn't, is like Sinwar, then you don't need a Chamberlain, you need a Churchill. So 2 questions. Is Nasrallah the same as Sinwar in this sociopathic hatred of Jews? And if so, who is your Churchill? Because you're going to have to fight a war on both fronts.
I think Nasrallah, in some ways, Nasrallah is worse. He has a proper military. The Radwan force is much more capable than anything Hamas can field before the war or now. In other ways, he's much easier to deal with because, frankly, Sinwar is literally willing to fight to the death of the last Gazan and is, as we said, extremely frustrated that Israel isn't actually killing that many Gazans. A sentence I say with the enormous caveat that a great many Gazans have died, but nevertheless not remotely close, not a tenth of what Sinwar need to die in order to, in his view, in order to believe that he, has the Israelis over a barrel. It's actually a war that's been fought very competently in that sense. Nasrallah is more sensitive because he lives inside a larger Lebanon, because he has masters in Tehran, as you just said, who, if they feel that an exchange of fire with Israel is going to cost them directly, can order him to heal. He is actually a branch of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in a way that Hamas is not. So I happen to believe that a war in the north is a war that will be faster, more devastating, but it takes a serious decision. Hugh, for 8 months now, tens of thousands of Israelis haven't been able to go home. The 5.5 kilometers to the border, those towns, those villages, are empty. They are ghost towns. Hezbollah has created a security zone inside Israel because of the Israeli government's inability to make decisions, because we have a prime minister who has always, throughout his history, taken the path of least resistance. And I'm just going to see this through to the end here and take all the hate mail all at once. If you put Netanyahu on mute, don't listen to his clever verbiage and his great interviews. By the way, he came onto your show, but he won't interview with me. He has not interviewed with Israeli press for 2 months in the middle of a war.
Well, this was 2 years ago when his memoir came out, when he was right before he took office again. He did.
Oh, okay.
Show. Yeah.
He went on Dan Senor's podcast a month ago and hasn't come. and hasn't interviewed with the Israeli press. So that's the, but if you put him on mute and you look, at the last 8 months of war, just on accomplishments, and then you look at the last 5 years, you look at the massive expansion of the Israeli welfare state, and you ask, where's the old conservative Netanyahu? You look at the last 10 years and you ask, what are his great achievements? There was one enormous achievement that Israel achieved. He took credit for it, which is the Abraham Accords. He certainly didn't screw it up, which is a big deal. That's not a small thing. It's very easy to have failed that kind of moment, but it's a Saudi initiative and not an Israeli one. If you actually look at the last 10 years, I don't think this person who survives by taking the path of least resistance can see us through this war. The tragedy isn't that I don't think it. The tragedy is that every poll, including by right-wing pollsters, tells us that most Israelis don't think it. And so he is leading, that distrust in him 8 months into the war is leading to a collapse of morale among the Israeli public. And I don't want to get into it, but just as a side mention, Likud just confirmed last night in a late night vote a bill to continue to exempt the ultra-Orthodox from military service, even as 2 members of my family keep getting called up to a very dangerous military service because of their politics. So we have a government playing politics while every other Israeli is sacrificing and suffering, and that's not sustainable.
Haviv, now this is where Americans need guidance, because we see everything through an American lens. We see your Supreme Court intervening constantly in politics. We hate that here, and so we think Netanyahu is right on the court. But then people explain to me, as you just did, Netanyahu takes the path of least resistance, and that's appeasement. What is the way out if the predicate, and I believe this to be the case, war is inevitable with Lebanon and probably Iran as part of World War III, and China is our problem, not your problem. But what is the way out? Who's got a plan? It certainly doesn't seem to me like Yair Lapid does. It doesn't seem to me like Benny Gantz does. Who's got a plan?
That's a great and important question. I have to tell you, it's not a partisan question for most Israelis, as far as I can tell. I have to suss this out from the polling numbers. The least trusted politician in Israel right now is Benjamin Netanyahu. The most trusted in those same polls is Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, who is of the same party, right? So this isn't that Israelis have turned on the right or have turned on Likud. It is a specific personal experience. I happen to think that Likud has an extraordinarily competent front bench. From Gallant to a guy named Yuli Edelstein, who was Speaker of the Knesset and a minister for many years and is now chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, to Nir Barkat, a successful high-tech entrepreneur who is also, right now the economy minister. There is a serious front bench. Around Gantz, are incredibly competent people who we have trusted in the past with our national security in periods when we had much better national security. People once appointed by Netanyahu in glowing terms. And Lapid had a short time, about 10 years ago, he was in power for 2 years, and he was an extremely unsuccessful finance minister. He produced policies that were very populist and very silly. We could get into them, but they're very boring, but I can defend that statement. Lapid has a glass ceiling. In other words, he has about 20 seats out of 120, about 1/6 of the Israeli public is capable of voting for him time after time and poll after poll. And over the course of a long period of 15 years, he has never broken that 1/6. So he probably can't be prime minister in that sense because he just doesn't have the record for it. So you're right to question. But here's the thing. Netanyahu functions as a kind of cork that's stuck in the middle in the political system, as a bottleneck that prevents new leadership from coming up. The Israeli political system is riddled with people coming up through the Likud ranks or through other coalition parties that have been shunted aside because they were a threat to him over the years. And because he's been in power for so long, he's also centralized power tremendously. The Israeli Foreign Ministry, for example, almost can't run any kind of foreign policy of any kind. Everything has been moved to the Prime Minister's office, to the Mossad, to the National Security Council. And so you have agency after agency that doesn't actually get to run any policy in a Netanyahu government. And then you have these politicians who therefore feel very irresponsible and can say whatever they want and don't actually have to be accountable for their policies. We used to have more competent governments where every minister had a tremendous amount of influence over their policy. Voters felt like their votes mattered. We need to uncork ourselves from this bottleneck and actually get back to a broader spectrum coalition of competent people who can see us through this difficult moment. Gantz is a legitimate prime minister if Gallant is a defense minister, and there's a broad national coalition where a lot of different voices. By the way, this isn't a left-wing argument. One of the most surprising discoveries I have had over the last 8 months is that I keep agreeing with Bezalel Smotrich of the Religious Zionism Party. He said about what I am saying about Netanyahu in Gaza, about the delay, about the hemming and the hawing and the succumbing to American pressure. Some of the American demands are just incompetent, and his one job is to push back on them.
Haviv, I want to pay you first the ultimate compliment in terms of being a writer. I have no idea who you vote for. I have no idea what you'll say about anything. And I appreciate that. That's what journalism used to be, except for opinion journalists, what I am. You seem to me to be objective. With that in mind, do you think Biden is attempting, or the Biden administration is attempting to collapse the Netanyahu government? And do they know what they're doing when they do that? Because Israeli politics are beyond my ken. In fact, I think they're beyond the ken of any American. They're too complicated.
I find myself constantly arguing with Americans, especially American conservatives, on this point. We're not arguing fundamentally about the wisdom of the Biden policy so much as about the intent. I suspect that there are people in the Biden administration who think that they're very clever and that they can, intervene in Israeli politics and have it go their way. But if they do believe that, then they're very foolish, because Netanyahu's one great superpower is being able to make the case that that's happening and to then turn that to his massive advantage. When Chuck Schumer came out and said, Netanyahu is the one problem, we all love Israel. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. Netanyahu's people in Israel played that on rerun for days and days and days, and Netanyahu actually got something like a 4-point boost in the polls. So Netanyahu hopes that the Biden administration tries to oust him. He's going to try and pretend it is, even if it isn't. That's I don't know what conversation is being held inside the National Security Council or with the president or whatever on that score. But if they are, then that's very foolish. I'll just say that the Biden administration's real problem is that I think that at this point our interests have diverged profoundly. The American administration looks at this region, looks at Gaza, looks at Lebanon, looks at Iran, and says stability is the most important thing. But Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis and all the different allies and proxies of Iran have created a so-called status quo, I'll call it that, even though it's only for the last 8 months, that Israel can't live with. And so what the Americans de facto have, Blinken did it just in the last couple of days, where he had conversations with the Israelis. The commander of CENTCOM had a conversation with the chief of staff of the IDF, and the conversations have all been the same. They have been conversations about the Americans don't want the war to expand to Lebanon because the Israeli government can no longer just politically stand, right? Netanyahu until now could vaguely hint that Gantz was holding him back. Gantz was never holding him back. Netanyahu was holding himself back. But Gantz is gone now. And so Netanyahu, everything rests on him. And the Israeli public's displeasure with the war and the fact that the northern border is a disaster zone, there are entire towns there where a third of the homes are demolished just from 8 months of slow simmering sort of rocket fire. That's all on Netanyahu's head. And so I think the Israelis are finally, just because of public rage, which is something Netanyahu does see and understand and know how to respond to, are moving toward a much, much more aggressive posture. And the American response is, no, don't do anything, stand still. That is a deep divergence of interests, and we're going to see that play out. And it's a shame that the Biden administration slowed down the war in Gaza and keeps preventing the war in Hezbollah, because it's trying to avoid that political problem back in the U.S. The August convention of the Democrats scares the Biden administration, the Biden campaign. The problem is that these wars are still coming. They can't prevent them.
I appreciate, Haviv, you're taking the time and spending this much time with my audience, which is big, but it's not the audience that Dan reaches. It's a different audience, and I'm glad that you're here talking to them. We have 6 minutes. What do you think is going to happen? Because we're in a sort of a state of suspended animation, watching Israel fight with its young men, continually exhausted, redeploying again and again and again, and not dealing with the problem in Lebanon and not responding with major force against Iran. And I don't know that even the center right in America, which is Israel's great anchor of support, in America is the center right. I don't know that they have the ability to hang in there with Israel through a non-winning strategy. I mean, a refusal to declare what we're going to do in order to win. And there is no such declaration. So put on your prophet. I know you're not a prophet or a son of a prophet, but prophesy for us what's going to happen in the next 8 months.
I think there absolutely is the ability to say what we need to do in order to win. And one of my great faults of our government is that they have refused to talk. They have refused to say it. They've refused to go on the Israeli press and interview and speak to the Israeli public in Hebrew, never mind the world, the international community or the public in America. It's very simple. We defeated Arab armies when they amassed against us in tank columns. And so they didn't amass against us in tank columns anymore. They went for terrorism. And we defeated the terrorism. We became extremely good at counter-terrorists. And so they went against us in new ways. And they keep finding new ways to reshape the battlefield and redefine victory and come at us in order to destroy us. They have now hit on a strategy that we are actually finding extremely difficult to deal with. And the strategy is astonishingly simple and astonishingly difficult. Being willing to have their own people die en masse to destroy us. That's the strategy. Sinwar said so in every letter he's ever sent. But it's also public and public knowledge, and every leader of Hamas has said it in public interviews that are all available, translated on the internet. If you don't know this, you don't want to know this. I'm speaking of many Western journalists. And that's also true of Hezbollah. That's basically true of Iran. Iran will fight us to the last Arab, right? It won't let the war come to them, to the Iranian leadership, but it is willing to launch wars against us on 4 or 5 different fronts. And so now we face an enemy in Lebanon that we have to push back. The international community did its thing. It passed 2 Security Council resolutions that say Hezbollah has to be disarmed and Hezbollah has to go north of the Litani River out of shooting distance of our cities. And Hezbollah laughed and didn't. And now the American mediator in Lebanon is trying to sell Israelis on the idea that he can reach a diplomatic solution in which Hezbollah will, for the first time ever, actually do what the international community says without the Israelis wreaking on it the kind of devastation that forces it to explain to the Lebanese why it brought that war on Lebanon. I am skeptical. If the Americans can deliver that diplomatic agreement, great. It has never worked before, not once, with Hezbollah, ever. It is the exact opposite of what Hezbollah is. So it's a simple point. Their new and hopefully final strategy against us is devastation of their own polities in order to destroy us. Here's the problem with Lebanon. If you go to Lebanese social media, your heart will break because the Lebanese people are terrified of the war they know Hezbollah is bringing upon them by never-ending bombardment of Israel. And Israel will have to go to that war. It won't be Gaza. It won't be slow. It won't be grinding. There won't be hostages to pull out. It'll be fast. I don't know how to avoid it being devastating. I can tell you one point and then I'll stop talking. 100,000 villagers in those 200 villages of South Lebanon fled the south and still haven't come back 8 months later because the Lebanese villagers, just like the Israelis living in those towns in the north, fled their homes, know that war is coming. So there is this war coming. The lack of appetite for it among the Americans, among even pro-Israel, constituencies all over the world, is exactly the war strategy of the enemy. Our only choice is to plow through it and take it on the chin and still somehow win.
1 minute, Haviv. What would you like to hear from Americans? As a serious Israeli, as someone with family in the fight, and himself, if there is this war in Lebanon, every single Israeli will be under a threat from those missiles. What do you want Americans to say out loud and mean it from the White House and Congress?
We will fight for ourselves. America has given us more than we have a right to expect. America just sent us huge amounts of money to fund Iron Beam, which is going to make us much safer. It's going to patch a lot of holes in our missile defense. America has given us a lot. I don't need America to fight for us. There's one part of this war, and it is the big part, and it is the part America has a desperate interest in, that America is refusing to fight, and that's Iran. You don't need boots on the ground. You need massive sanctions, massive pressure at every turn. You need clever people in the Treasury. You need clever people at state doing nothing morning, day, and night but trying to figure out ways to hurt the Iranian regime. And you need it now, and you need it for the next 10 years. And if you do that, you don't solve Israel's problem in the Middle East. you solve about 11 different wars and catastrophes that are destroying entire nations in the Middle East. What Iran has done to Yemen, no enemy of Yemen has ever done to Yemen, and it did it on the pretext of helping Yemen. So America needs, Iran is in the Chinese orbit. Iran is an absolute enemy of America, a funder of America's enemies. Get Iran. That's something you can do that we can't.
And that is a great place to end. When we come back the next time, Haviv, I want to talk about China, because that's our number one strategic enemy in the way that Iran is Israel's number one strategic enemy. But Iran is the bridge that connects it all together. And we'll talk about that next time. Haviv Rettig Gur, senior analyst for the Times of Israel, thank you for joining me on the Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem News Channel and the Salem Radio Network.